Hello again. We're going to talk now about specific types of predictors, but before we do, let's just pull up a little reminder for us. Let's remember about validity, all right? Remember validity as a rule, validity. In fact, step back, reliability as a concept. Reliability is the ability of a test to measure the same thing over and over and over. Validity is whether or not a test is measuring what it is supposed to measure. Okay, so you remember those two basic ideas behind reliability and validity. And so when we're talking about predictors, it's criterion validity that is by far the most important. A predictor must be related to a criterion, right? You want to use a predictor, a test that, an SAT test, to predict a criterion, college graduation rates. There you go, okay? So the predictor of SAT scores should be related to the criterion of college graduation, okay? And so the correlation between the score on the predictor and the score on the criterion is what criterion validity is all about. So we call these the R from the correlation, validity coefficients. And as you know, just to keep this thought in your mind, it's not the R itself that is particularly informative. I mean, it's useful, but R squared, because remember R squared is percentage of variance in the criterion accounted for by the predictor. And so R squared is sort of like, generically, if I know the score on the predictor, how much of the criterion will I be able to understand? Something like that. It's a little more complex, but it's a basic. So we'll look at different types of predictors, broke them down into standardized tests and other types of predictors, and some of these standardized tests being general versus specific cognitive ability. And then when we get into more specific types of job predictions, we'll get into some of these other ones. Okay. So first, general cognitive ability. There is a belief that this general cognitive ability, just a fancy word for intelligence, is the most important predictor of success at jobs. And there's probably a basis of truth if you think about intelligence in terms of G. G is, if you take, let's say, my cognitive class, I'll spend a lot of time on this, but G is sort of like a general cognitive ability that rides over the top of any specific skill you might have. And so you might have a general cognitive ability, but yet your verbal skills are different from your visual spatial skills, which are different from your quantitative skills, but somehow visual spatial, quantitative, and verbal skills are all tied into your general cognitive ability. So this general cognitive ability that exists separate or overriding every individual skill that you have. So we find that these general cognitive ability tests are by far the most common predictors used. I mean, obviously the SAT is a general cognitive ability test. There is some controversies here, and again, it's probably not the place to do it, but it's interesting controversies, that's for sure. Interesting controversies. So general cognitive ability as a whole, across all job performance, okay, where it's just quite large. 0.25 as far as the R squared goes, or 0.53 is the coefficient itself, and it's pretty impressive because I mean all around the world this number comes out, and it just doesn't really matter what the job is, and so it's kind of a broad statement, but I'm going to say it. There is no predictor that is better at predicting job performance across the world. Now, if you're getting to a specific job and predicting success on a specific job, then yeah, we're going to talk certain tests are better for that prediction. But we're talking about all jobs everywhere are well predicted by general cognitive ability tests. Okay? Look, a research meta-analysis, general cognitive ability accounts for up to 25% of the variance. R squared is 0.25. And yeah, look at that, as I just sort of said. Specific cognitive ability sometimes plays a more important role in predicting performance in a specific job. And I mean, I'm cool with that. So We're going to talk about general cognitive ability tests and then separately specific cognitive ability tests. So the general cognitive ability tests, which are designed to capture G, that global intelligence factor. Some of the common ones, boy, I've just repeated the numbers here, so you're welcome. You can get them twice. But common ones include the Wonderlic, the WAIS, the Raven's progressive matrices. We find some of the controversy in general intelligence tests is that you need to have cultural knowledge in order to succeed. Say, for example, in the WAIS, it has certain items like in what month is Independence Day or something like that. I can't remember exactly, but imagine that test was on the WAIS, and it's like, well, you kind of have to have an understanding of American culture to know that the 4th of July is, and so it relies too much on specific cultural knowledge, many critics say. The Raven's progressive matrices, however, was designed as a general cognitive ability test that is supposed to be culture-free, absolutely and utterly culture-free. That is, it does not involve any culturally based knowledge. And so the Ravens is a good alternative if you're trying to measure general cognitive ability independent from cultural knowledge. But it doesn't matter whether or not it's, quote, biased or not. These other, the Wonderlic and the WAIS, which have that cultural bias, they predict job performance, period. They just do. And I mean, in the world of IO Psych, that's really what, you don't care why it predicts job performance, you care it does predict job performance. And so here is some typical items that might be on the Wonderlic. Focused is the opposite of, focused is hopeful, concern. Scattered? Yeah, I guess. Oh, look, it's in italics to help me. I like it. Thank you for helping me with the answer. So, the Wonderlic is the place that it becomes popular is in football players. All football players take the Wonderlic, and it's part of the selection process when drafting football players. And so we find that some of the Cowboys have, hey, Tony Romo was famously had quite a high Wonderlic score. Even Dak Prescott has a pretty good score, above average anyway. But then they show, oh, famously, so one of the Cowboys, I wish I remembered his name, had a 4. The average is 20. He got a 4. All right. Woo, lordy. Anyway, we'll just move on from there. You know, go Cowboys. Okay. The WAIS is the most well-known, well-accepted, well-used, and expensive test of cognitive ability. But the WAIS, what it does is it takes this thing and says, okay, you have this general cognitive ability, this general ability that you carry with you from situation to situation to situation. But in each type of situation, you might fare differently based on what they call specific. So they have G factors and specific factors. And so there might be a specific factor of verbal abilities. And even verbal ability is composed of many skills, like vocabulary, similarities, comprehension, things of this nature. So you would have all kinds of sub-skills within this thing called verbal ability. And then you might have performance subtests, which would be like completing pictures or digit symbol coding. So there'll be like every time in this list of symbols, every time you see a triangle, put it in an 8. Every time you see a square, put it in a 5. Every time you see a circle, put it in a 3. And your job is as quickly as possible to substitute digits or something. But some of the other ones, block design, here's some blocks with different shapes, and your job is here's a picture, your job is to take these blocks and make that picture happen. So it's, interesting stuff, but it's definitely performance rather than the others. Well, specific cognitive ability tests might be more useful when it comes to specific type jobs, okay? There are mechanical ability tests, spatial ability tests, and clerical ability tests. And these have R's of 0.4 to 0.5, which is pretty decent. And again, R squared is 16% to 25%, something like that. And so what we find is, not that, ew, silly. Here, for example, is a mechanical ability, a specific cognitive ability test for mechanical ability. This is the SRA test of mechanical concepts. And so it's asking questions related to mechanical skills. Which of these stools is most likely to be steady on an uneven surface? Okay, and apparently the answer is C. I wouldn't necessarily know. It kind of makes sense, I guess. If you had obviously one leg and two leg aren't really going to cut it on any surface, right? And I guess by the time you get to 5 or 7 or whatever that is on the far side, 6, I guess. Yeah, that makes sense. Mechanical tools. This is what type of saw? I'm trying to remember my ninth grade wood shop. I don't know. Okay, spatial ability tests. Again, these might be more appropriate for like mechanics or architects, but it might involve things like mental rotation, might involve if you fold this up, what's it going to look like, things of this nature. And that's pretty clever. And then finally, something like a clerical ability test, relevant for like bookkeepers, clerks, secretaries, things of this nature. And so it'd be like, compare these names and, find the different, which ones are different from each other. Compare the numbers, which ones are different from each other. Okay, cool. Another interesting predictor is emotional intelligence. Okay, and emotional intelligence is the ability to control your own emotions, to understand others' emotions, to express your emotions properly. It's really I mean, they're useful in the workplace and in home life, but they can have correlations of up to 0.47 with job performance. But it's really all about understanding peer social interactions. And so that almost goes back to contextual performance. Those other skills that are not job performance per se, but are intimately related to both job performance and success of the company. All right. There are psychomotor tests. Psychomotor tests are probably the most appropriate for, say, like assembly lines. And so what they'll have is they're measuring speed and accuracy of sensory processes. And so look at that, a packer, a machine operator, assembler, electrician. But even a fighter pilot, air traffic controller, and baseball player have to have very fast reaction times, okay? You need to have good dexterity to be an assembler, for example, to assemble small parts. And so one of the most famous is the Purdue pegboard test. I mean, okay, you have 3 minutes, and here's this big board with holes and a whole bunch of pegs. Put in as many pegs as you can, and when you fill the board, take as many pegs as you can out, and if you finish that, start putting them back in again. Okay, and it's amazing that it accounts for quite a bit of the variance, in job performance for these specific jobs, okay? Not for other jobs. So validities for all tests differ as a function of the job. Well, duh, okay. Personality tests. These are dangerous, by the way. They measure individual traits. The ocean. Remember the big 5 personality traits: openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And what we find is that they can be great predictors, can be. But do we have to be careful, okay? And so, say, for example, the MMPI. The MMPI was normed, it was validated, shall we say, using clinical samples. And it's being used by industry for non-clinical populations, selection of employees that are not in the clinical population. And that is just one of the fundamental no-nos of prediction. It's got to do with the restricted range. If you only looked at this, don't use this to predict this. Over here, I'm off camera, right? But that's just a fundamental problem of all prediction, not just the I/O prediction. So we find that personality tests do make some sense, because, I mean, look at this under my head here. A job analysis might reveal that an important component of job success might be being a team player, something like that. Well, clearly being a team player is a personality trait. It is an aspect of personality. So you can use them well. But what do we find is that any non-cognitive ability test can be faked. Okay, well, you can fake a cognitive ability test by blowing the test, but personality tests can be faked. You can make yourself look any way you want, and this creates some real problems in their ability to predict. Of course, it affects validity. Does faking look validity? Yes, and so we find that in fact the MMPI does in fact have a lie scale. It does, in fact, ask essentially the same question, because the MMPI, by the way, it's like 520 yes-no questions, something like that. And so inside of these 500 questions, you'll find like 5 times we're going to ask the same question with slightly different words and maybe backwards and stuff like this. And so if your answers to these 5 questions that are essentially the same question with slightly different words and maybe backwards don't match each other, you're lying. Okay? And so they do have a catch for it for whatever it's worth. There is a catch in there. So about 1/3 to 1/2 of applicants fake, and fakers engage in counterproductive behavior. People that fake, and like we said, there's a lie scale on an MMPI. They know who does and does not fake, and they have found people that do in fact choose to fake the test tend to engage in more counterproductive behaviors. So they are what they are. I've seen these personality tests used not just for selection at the beginning, employment selection, but also for like placement into work teams. Because again, if you go, I didn't even talk about it here, but if you use a Myers-Briggs, for example, that's just one of the big personality tests. And the Myers-Briggs, it identifies types of people, something like this. And so what happens is if you put 10 people into a work group, into a team, and we'll talk more about those, and they all have the exact same personality type, well, then you're not getting 10 different perspectives on a problem. You're getting 10 people giving the same perspective because they all have the same personality type. So there's something to them, perhaps. Integrity tests. These are ruthless, but they are tests of honesty, right? Attempts to predict whether an employee will engage in counterproductive or dishonest behavior. And I took one of these once. I was silly in college and was going to get a job at a gas station. I didn't know what I was doing. And so they gave me this integrity test. Now I don't blame them, by the way, because that's where they lose money is employees that steal cash, employees that steal product in the gas station area in the back, whatever. People that steal stuff. But the questions on there are just like, have you ever stolen anything in your life? And you're like, well, duh, everybody has stolen something in their life. But what's the correct answer? What should I really put? So don't tell anybody I stole anything because I haven't. I just was pretending. So, have you ever stolen anything? Well, interesting because, and then they have personality type integrity tests, which look at things such as risk-taking, dishonesty, emotional instability. And these personality traits of risk-taking, dishonesty, and emotional instability are highly related to negative work behaviors. But what we find is that since, I believe it was 1988, employers are not allowed to use lie detector tests. That is illegal now. And so these integrity tests have to fill the bill. Oh, where did I go? Huh? Oh, I'm way down here somewhere. What do they do? You are just terrible. Whoa, how did I get so far? Oh, there I am. Okay. I'm back. Okay, work samples. These previous predictors, it's interesting they predict job performance, but they don't look anything like performance on the job. The SAT scores or what's required to take the SAT doesn't really resemble what it takes to perform well in college. Okay, something like this. Well, that's not necessarily true, by the way. This is there was just an attempt on this. The ACT has always been better in that the skills required to score highly on the ACT are the skills necessary for success in college. And so the SAT recently has revamped itself and completely revamped. Some of you may well have been a victim of that SAT overhaul, but that overhaul was an attempt to make itself more like the ACT so that the actual skills on the SAT are the same types of skills required for success in college. So it's more than just prediction, which is what the old SAT was. The old SAT score did in fact predict college success, but yet it didn't make a lot of sense, but it did. However, these work samples use as their fundamental basis the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. And using this basic statement, work samples will attempt to predict job performance based on what you've been doing. And so a work sample, say for example, yeah, when I got this job at Texas Wesleyan University, when I came in for the job interview, one of the most important, if not the most important component of the job interview was in fact a demonstration of a teaching demonstration. I taught a general psych class. Actually, it was funny because I got applause at the end of the class. The only time they've ever applauded me at the end of the class, but you applaud right now, I won't even know it. All right, so very interesting. And so you get tests like a driving test, all right? And therefore, the driving test is supposed to involve skills which resemble a successful driver, okay? So it makes a lot of sense that you would want to do that. Look at that, not a predictor in a traditional sense. It's like an imitation of the criterion. All right, that makes a lot of sense. That's interesting. Situational judgment tests are a paper and pencil or perhaps video scenario where applicants are being asked, how would you handle a situation in which, okay? And so it's similar to a work samples, but it's kind of like hypothetical. How would you, okay? And so very important, incremental validity over performance, personality tests, etc., 0.34. That's pretty impressive. So when we say R equals 0.34 for work or for the situational judgment test, we mean once you've already accounted for the variance that is caused by personality test, cognitive ability test, job experience, this is in addition to that. So this is a powerful 0.34, that's for sure. Assessment centers. Now, if you are, in fact, running a gas station, you cannot have an assessment center. Assessment centers are big. You have to have an entire area within your human resources department devoted only to this topic. And so it is expensive. It takes multiple days. There are many, many assessments involved. Major companies have them. Look at that, 2 to 3 days, multiple assessors, assesses, I don't know, exercises, etc. And so when brought together, you can get quite a powerful predictive ability. Began in the 30s. And so assessment center data, here was a longitudinal study where employees that were selected for AT&T between 56 and 60, they went through an assessment center and then traced 30 years later. Assessment center scores correctly identified 94% of the people that were unlikely to be promoted. And so the assessment centers were able to say this person probably will not be promoted, and 94% of the time they were correct 30 years later. So pretty powerful thing right there. Okay, assessment center exercises. Yeah, the in-basket exercise. The assessee is like basically pretend you're the manager, okay? And here are all of the things a manager has at their disposal. Here's a problem. Your job is to solve the problem and prepare a statement for the board of directors outlining your plan for this problem. Holy crap, okay? Interesting. Leaderless group discussion, again, it requires multiple assessees get together, and nobody's a leader. Nobody's assigned a leader. Instead, throw them in a room, and here is a problem. Okay? How are you going to resolve this problem? Okay? And so clearly what's going to happen is, as they're being observed, is a few of the people in this group discussion are going to emerge and show the managerial skills necessary to guide that group. Ooh. Wow. Oh, here's an interesting example of an in-basket exercise. It's a lot of words. Feel free to go for it. But that is what this is about. Is like, imagine you're the manager, and here is a problem. Biographical information is potentially troublesome and interesting. I Sometimes what happens is employers just grab random stock. What would we call them? Stock. Generic application blanks from an office supply store that just asks a series of questions. And the problem is that they're opening themselves up to lawsuits because you need to be able to demonstrate each and every question being asked on an application needs to in some way or another relate to job performance. Okay? And if you can't demonstrate this, then all of a sudden somebody might be able to say, look, I filled in this application and there was all of these questions that were unrelated to job performance. How do I know they were not used as part of the selection procedure? Okay? And so BioData questionnaires is a little bit different, but more specific for a specific job. And so here, I can't read it because it's too tiny on my computer, but biodata items for customer service position. And so it's basically those demographic questions that are relevant. Isn't that what it says? Wow. Oh my gosh, I can't read this. You're going to have to read that yourself. I can't read that. What's interesting related to this biodata is nowadays your online profile, that is all the shit you've done on the internet, is being used as part of the predictive devices. So it's a little bit different from biographical information, but it's in the same ballpark. You're putting information out there that companies are using to make predictions about you. Okay? Letters of recommendation. Letters of recommendation are troublesome. There was actually companies that were sued by employees for libel. So if a company puts out a letter of recommendation that is bad, the former employee goes back to them and says, "Hey, I'm suing you because I can't get a job in the future because you're telling lies about me." Or how about this? A company has hired an employee that had good letters of recommendation and they turned out to be a horrendous employee, and so they go back to the original company that wrote the letter of recommendation and said, you knew this was a shitty employee and yet you gave a good recommendation. And I mean, let's be honest, sometimes you're going to write a good letter of recommendation for a shitty person because you want to get them out of your hair, okay? You want them out of there. And so, interesting idea. But we've gotten to a point, kind of like letter of recommendation inflation, where I've seen lots of letters of recommendation, and you just assume they're all going to be wonderful. And so nowadays, letters of recommendation seem to be useful mostly only in the sense that if a letter of recommendation is not glowing, then that is a red flag. Okay? And so assume that if you are an acceptable candidate, you will have glowing letters of recommendation. Okay? If you are an outstanding candidate, you will have glowing letters of recommendation. If you are a shitty candidate, you will have letters of recommendation that are slightly less glowing. So it's like a red flag mechanism rather than a selection procedure per se. But that's in academia. I don't know, what are they doing in industry? That's academia. Interviews. Yeah, interviews are very important. 80 to 90% of organizations use interviews. And again, it's designed to predict future performance based on oral questions. But it's also difficult because it assumes that the person doing the interview somehow has some insight that could not be gained in other tests. Okay? And I'm not teaching social psychology today, but clearly there's lots of evidence that shows overconfidence in all judgments. And so this notion of overconfidence, of course it applies to this situation. Interviewers are overconfident in their ability to judge the success of applicants. But research has shown that raw data is a better predictor. hell, I'll take it out there. There was clinical psychologists that were asked, when patients were released from the mental hospital, and they were asked to predict the likelihood of the patient's readmission in the mental hospital. And then they simply measured how thick was the patient's medical file. And it turned out the thickness of medical file was a better predictor of readmission than the clinicians with PhDs. So clearly, human nature is faulty, so interviews by themselves can be troublesome. Interviews can be structured or unstructured. Structured interviews are better because they're less subjective. They're less based on personal biases. A structured interview is really a data point. An unstructured interview, however, is a way to produce a gut level feeling in the interviewer. Okay, and so clearly you find that unstructured are not as good. We can talk about structured interviews in terms of a behavioral description or a situational interview. And so in a behavioral description interview, we're going to talk about what did you do in the past. A situational interview is, imagine you're in this situation in the future, how would you respond? Interviews are stronger than they seem like they should be. And in particular, structured interviews are better than unstructured interviews. And this validity is beyond, not... Once you measure general cognitive ability and personality, interviews do add some more. Okay, so keep in mind that 0.44 and that 0.33 would be if the only thing you did was an interview. So if you've already done a general cognitive ability test and a personality test, it will add something to those two, but most certainly not this much. Okay, these are just numbers if it was standing alone. We find that there is a lot of biases as a fact when it comes to interviews. Attractive applicants are always rated higher in the interview process. So, Interview questions that shouldn't be asked. Another one I can't read. Oh my God. How old are you? Essentially, look at personnel law, and these questions violate personnel law. Yeah, there's a whole lot of interview questions you can't ask, and age is definitely one of the most important ones. So we find that various, in fact, take a look. This is a nice summary. So keeping in mind the whole point of these predictors is to predict the criterion, predict job performance. And again, we want to keep in mind that it's not just the ability to predict, but as we just described in some decent detail, once I've already, and by the way, the key to this is when using these predictors, start with the cheapest ones. So if you have an inexpensive general cognitive ability test, use that first. And then if you have a personality test and it's relatively cheap and easy to administer, use that second. And find out how much, after you've accounted for the cognitive ability test, how much more comes from personality. Because, of course, some of that is overlap. And so the idea is to create as much unique prediction as possible, which is why that interview, which sounds good at 0.44, might not be that good when we talk about unique or incremental ability to predict. All right, so I'll stop with that one today, and I'll see you later.